Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event today to celebrate Arabic literature. My name is Ghazi Gheblawi. I'm a trustee at the Banipal Trust for Arabic Literature, and we are really truly honored to be here with SOAS to celebrate Arabic literature translation, and specifically to have the annual lecture, which has been going on for nearly 10 years now, and also to celebrate the winning translator of the 2024 Saif Ghobash Banipal Prize. It's been going on for 20 years, so that's quite an achievement. We are happy to welcome you all and to celebrate this event among enthusiasts and also readers and writers and also translators. We'll kick off with some few welcoming words from Professor Graeme Earl, Dean of the College of Humanities at SOAS University. Thank you.
Hello all, I shall be brief. It's wonderful, really wonderful to see you all here at SOAS. Yeah, I'm the Dean of the College of Humanities here, which is the Arts, Humanities and Languages across SOAS. I'm an archaeologist and I've spent quite a lot of my time working in Egypt and surrounding areas. So I'm going to be particularly paying attention here. Sadly, I have no Arabic, to my constant shame. But it is my great, and Wen-chin, he's very gentle with me. It's my great pleasure to see you all here for this the celebration of Arabic literature and translation, and also more than a quarter of a century of Banipal Trust's support and collaboration, including the work, of course, with SOAS. We at SOAS take very seriously our role of doing exactly what we're doing here, which is bringing people together to look at things and hear things and see and understand them from different perspectives, whether those are from different language perspectives or regional ones, or because of different backgrounds, or because of different roles and disciplines. And goodness, we need more of that. And so what today reflects, and I think what we'll learn about later, is how utterly fundamental it is to come together with art and with understanding and with disagreement and all of the things in between. We are very lucky in that we have our Centre for Translation Studies. We have the Centre for Postcolonial and Cultural Literary Studies. And of course, we're lucky that each of the perspectives that you all bring, because of course what we need are things that are easy to say, difficult to write beautifully, and very difficult to do. So we need intercultural understanding, proper understanding. We need that understanding to be grounded in a genuine sense of social justice and the implications of, we might understand things, but then we have to act as a consequence of that understanding. And then we also need to build communities, harmonious communities as far as possible. And of course, the best way to do that is through art, through culture and shared experiences. So the scholar and translator that we celebrate here this evening, so Margaret and Katharine, and what they collectively will tell us and have produced, gives me some more hope that those three things are possible. We know they're important. I have to say, I come in every day to my job at SOAS full of beans, but always thinking, goodness, there's a lot to do, because there's a lot to do in universities. But I never leave without feeling like, goodness, we've done things at this place today, and I'm very proud to be a part of it. I say, very glad that we're all here today. So we can feel reassured, bringing artists together, humanists, reading exciting things, being challenged is what we need to make that harmonious community, to build that intercultural understanding. So I'm very proud to be here, and I look forward to learning more. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Professor Graeme Earl, for this introduction. And now we have a few words from the chair of the Banipal Trust for Arabic Literature, Professor Paul Starkey. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghazi, and thank you everybody for coming. It's very good to see so many of you here, and welcome also to those of you that are watching this evening's event over Zoom. So I'm not going to take much of your time. I'd just like to add a very brief welcome on behalf of the Banipal Trust for Arab Literature to the welcome from SOAS that you've just heard. First of all, of course, I should echo what's already been said and say that it's very good to have this association with SOAS, which started last year, and we're hoping that it may long continue. The Banipal Trust will not need much introduction to most of you, though the name itself, Banipal, is probably most closely associated in most people's minds with the magazine, which has sadly now closed in its English version, having published numberless translations from the Arabic for about 25 years, from 1998 onwards. The Banipal Trust worked closely with the magazine, and it has been organising an annual translation prize in conjunction with the Society of Authors since 2006, generously funded by the Ghobash family, to whom we remain most grateful. Most recently, or more recently, an annual lecture has been added to the Trust's activities, also funded by the Ghobash family. And last year, for the first time, we combined the lecture with the prize celebration, an experiment that seemed to work. Some of you may recall it in this very same room. So we're repeating this format again tonight. So tonight we shall have, first of all, a lecture by Margaret Litvin, followed by a conversation between Katharine Halls, that's Katharine with an A, winner of this year's prize, and Raphael Cohen, chair of the judges this year, and then a question and answer session with Professor Wen-chin Ouyang of SOAS. This is not, as most of you will be aware, a happy time for the Middle East. Has there ever been a happy time for the Middle East? Just sounds like an exam question, discuss, doesn't it? I shall resist the temptation to go on about the links between literature and politics and related matters, though I'm sure that our speakers will have plenty to say about this sort of thing later on in the evening. But perhaps it's worthwhile just giving a very short quote from Ahmed Nagy, the author of the book translated by Katharine, who noted that his work was a meditation on literature and books, on how reading and writing have the power to save us, even in the darkest places. End of quote. I think that's a very succinct sort of summation of what we're about on one level. So with that, no further ado, I will hand you back to our Master of Ceremonies for the evening, Ghazi, who will introduce this year's lecturer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Starkey. That's quite hard. Thank you. So tonight we'll be listening from Margaret Litvin on the topic we have today, which is translating Beauty and Revolt in Arab literature today. Margaret Litvin is an associate professor of Arabic and comparative literature at Boston University, core faculty in the Boston University MFA program in literary translation, and the recipient of ACLS and Humboldt and her Radcliffe Fellowships. She's the author of many books. One of them is The Hamlet Arab Journey, Shakespeare's Prince and Nasser's Ghost, 2011. We'll find it also outside if you want to get a copy. And translations from Arabic, including Sana'Allah Ibrahim's Ice from Seagull, 2019, and plays by Jawad al-Asadi and Mamdouh Adwan. She was awarded a 2023 PEN translation grant to translate Khalil al-Raz's Russian quartet, excerpts of which have appeared in Oxford University Press Anthology, Russian Arab Worlds, A Documentary History, 2023, and in Max Sweeney's. We welcome
Thank you so much. It is an incredible honor to be standing here giving this lecture tonight. I'm an avid follower of Banipal's activities and an avid reader of the magazine. And I'm delighted to be here with Katharine and looking forward to our conversation later. I've placed myself in a somewhat complicated position tonight. I have offered to speak to you about a resurgence of beauty in contemporary Arabic fiction and the demands that this places on the translator. I proposed this topic back in July before I knew, of course, who would win the prize and for what. But I hope I can still convince you that beauty is worth talking about, although it's a category that's been out of fashion in literary studies for the whole of my career thus far. And yes, for obvious reasons. The payoff, I hope, will be not only a pleasant stroll through some spectacular sentences, but an unexpected story about the value of literature and literary translation in dark times. So I will not argue that literary voices, that literary voices, by offering a window into the life worlds of people we don't know well, can help humanize a marginalized other, particularly the Arab other as translated for the European or American reader. That's not an interesting argument because we all know that. For many of us in this room, it's why we study or teach languages or translate literature in the first place, and dare I say particularly why we study or teach Arabic and translate Arabic literature today. I probably also don't need to show you how literature can be a powerful voice for human dignity, although I'll do a little of that just because human dignity is so tenacious, so fragile, and so evocative to think about. And dignity is fundamentally related to beauty. We will return to this. Mostly, I'll be exploring a different argument, one about literary strategy. Namely, the literary moves that have powered much of Arabic fiction for the past 60 years, starting with its programmatic ugliness, the kind of strategy of uglification. That strategy may no longer suffice, and it might not even work as intended. The Oedipal rebellion in Arabic letters has succeeded. The polite tradition of adab has somewhat faded from view. The shocking formal innovations in the 20th century may lack some of their old shock power, and in fact, they might be cliches now, pandering to the reader and being what Brecht would call simply culinary. Amid the hideously routinized state and non-state violence of the past few decades, what could be more countercultural and more radical than a beautiful person, a beautiful object, a beautiful idea? What could be a more pointed revolt against the forces that dominate Arab life and Arabic literature today? I don't know if I fully subscribe to this paradoxical view, but I'm attracted to it. And I think it underlies my vertiginous gamble of trying to translate the novel that Ghazi mentioned, which I'll tell you about today, The Russian Quarter by exiled Syrian novelist Khalil al-Raz. So, 2 disclaimers up front. First of all, this is not a very academic lecture. I don't know much about beauty in an academic sense. I've never studied aesthetics. But why is that the case? How can I be a decently plausible literary historian without knowing anything about aesthetics? Why have aesthetics been banished as philosopher Elaine Scarry puts it, from the humanities? Why have they been doubly banished from Arabic humanities? That's part of the situation we need to understand today. Also, a second disclaimer. I'm pretending to propose a kind of chronological argument about the course of Arabic literary history, but that's not really what I'm doing. Actually, I'm just probing a strong hunch built from a few very suggestive data points, some of which will be well known to many of you. And this is intended as a provocation for working translators and readers, rather than a definitive kind of history of Arabic literature. A return to beautiful writing is only one of the trends observed in Arabic prose today. Sadly, another one is the efflorescence of prison literature. Yet even these two currents can meet. As I hope to show you, they can even merge. So here's the plan. First, I want to define the strategy of programmatic ugliness, trace its most influential articulations in Arabic, analyze how it can be translated, and show how it can get exhausted or tapped out. Next, I want to explore three quite different literary works from 1987, 2004, and 2019, focusing on some ways they strategically deploy the beauty of certain scenes, characters, and sentences to counter the naked brutality of regime-inflicted violence, or to pierce the blandness of neoliberal kitsch. Although we've usually heard the word to aestheticize used in a derogatory, pejorative way, I want to insist on the power of aesthetics. Aesthetics, as I keep telling my students, many of whom are general education students and even pre-med, aesthetics are the opposite of anesthetics, which make you numb. The point of aesthetics is to make you feel. Contemporary Arabic literature has recuperated aesthetics, the ability to make people feel things in response to art, for revolution, for protest, or just to keep the imagination alive. And finally, if it's true that beauty has resurfaced as a value in Arabic prose, then this presents the English translator with some special challenges and pitfalls. So what are our hesitations and how should we respond? So first, programmatic ugliness. It responds to the very definition of adab. Along with literature, here's adab. Along with literature from the Hanswehr Dictionary, the word adab carries the meanings of education, politeness, manners. Another word for an adab khaneh is a bathroom, right? To be mu'addab is to be well-behaved rather than well-read. When someone is qalil at adab or deficient in adab, it's not because they haven't read enough, it's because they catcalled you on the street. The conflation of these two meanings of adab captures the original disciplinary function, disciplining role of belles-lettres at the imperial court of the Abbasids in Baghdad, keeping the courtiers in line, separating them from the unlettered masses, defining wordplay as a skill that people could cultivate and compete in, creating a hierarchy of distinction. That laid down the model, always available. Of course, it's not always blindly followed, but it's always there. The disciplinary idea of literature as a field for elegant virtuosity, putting beauty in the service of political power. In modern Arabic literature, too, literature has served a largely disciplinary function. Many writers of the Nahda or 19th century Arab Renaissance were also educators, and so the idea is never far of edifying the masses, of performing some kind of tathqif or culturing function. And even in the most postmodern avant-garde writers, you still scratch the surface and you'll hear them talking about the intellectual's role as somehow tathqif, as taking the masses from one place to another more cultured, advanced place. You hear this in 1920s emigre writers like Mikhail Naime and Khalil Gibran, who are determined to throw away classical conventions and seek a more sincere and direct expressive language, but they're still trying to move the reader toward a higher moral or spiritual or political, cultural plane. So around 60 years ago, yes, you knew I was going here, virtuosity came unhooked from virtue. In 1966, young Egyptian writer Saad Ibrahim emerged from Gamal Abdel Nasser's Oasis prison to write a searing, disgusting novella called Tilka Raiha. This novel is Exhibit A for programmatic ugliness as a strategy in Arabic. In flat and numb prose, the deeply traumatized narrator chronicles his painful return from political prison and his failure to reintegrate into a now crassly materialistic Egyptian society. The book depicts prison homosexuality and torture, as well as flatulence, impotence, masturbation. It does so in ill-formed sentences and broken flashbacks, like a clumsy camera. Publishing it was an attack on adab in both senses, and critics noticed. Respected Egyptian writer Yahya Haqqi, who wanted to support Ibrahim, was troubled by the physical response, the nauseating, right? Absolutely nauseating, the physical response that Ibrahim's text, or one scene in particular, provoked in him. And the taboo breaking was, of course, a deliberate act. Okay, move. It doesn't want to show you. Hang on, I want to show you. It was a deliberate act of protest. If you think this prose is ugly, Tilqara has seemed to say, look at this country. To beautify such corruption and filth would be a lie. So to make the point, the offending scene is spurred precisely by a passage on beauty in literature. And it's Maupassant's flowery ideas about literary beauty that make the disgusted narrator drop his pen and pick up something else. So with the crashing military defeat, that was 1966, now we're in 1967, Arab intellectuals gained a new reason to abjure beautiful writing. Not only is adab a gauze veil over a stinking wound, it's also a waste of Arab energies. The sharpest voices came from Syria. With the ney and mizmar, you don't win a war, snarled poet Nizar Qabbani in Notes on the Margins of the Setback, his bitter poem that led the June and July 1967 issue of Al-Adab magazine. Here you can see what he's doing with his unabashedly masculinist and self-orientalizing acid bath for Arab culture. His rhyming khitaba, dhababa, and rababa, all of Arabic rhetoric, epic poetry, and music, can't shoot down one Israeli plane or even kill a fly. That same year, Syrian playwright Abdallah Wannous, in his soiree for the 5th of June, shows a producer trying to put on an evening of country dancing and singing, nostalgia and delight, to cover up the truth about the military failure and the state failure in Syria during Israel's invasion. Going even further that year, philosopher Sadiq Jalal al-Azam, in his self-criticism after the defeat, attacked what he called the traditional Arab clinging to formalities, proprieties, appearances, and established routine. Adab in both senses, being well-behaved and well-lettered, had done the Arabs no favors. This attack had an immediate effect on Arabic literature. If art for art's sake had been coded conservative before, it was toxic now. Partly because it was a stylistic turn toward the West, the deliberate cultivation of ugly Arabic prose poses a challenge for the English translator. So coming back to Sanala's That Smell, we can see how Robin Cresswell in 2013 justifies his decision to redo the project, done by eminent translator Dennis Johnson Davies 40 years earlier. There's not so much translation of Arabic literature out there that we can afford to be retranslating stuff on a daily basis. You need a good reason. And Robin said it's because Johnson Davies had failed to capture that the style is aggressively unliterary, that it suffers from or benefits from an inelegance disturbing to the novel's original readers, and that it looks like Hemingway. So the challenge in English is not how to convey that bald style. It moves very easily into English. There are no deep puzzles of tense or diction or anything. The problem is how to convey its radical character, that it's not a pat on the back, but a slap in the face. Because Hemingway is the most cliche thing, it provokes a yawn. So if your publisher agrees to print the dialogue without quotation marks and the narrative as an undelimited wall of text, my publisher for ICE understandably refused. If that happens, you can convey a departure from decorum, but your English reader will be bored rather than provoked. So you need other tricks to reveal that this is an unstylish style. One of them, which I'm showing you here, is aggressive parataxis, and. She went in to sleep, and I slept too, and when I woke up, I looked for her in her room. Or else, it was the policeman. I went and got my notebook, and he signed it, and left, and I went back to my room, and turned off the light, and lit a cigarette, and stretched out on the bed, thinking of my father. So this is aggressive parataxis. It's not what you would normally do in English or even in Hemingway style, and it conveys the inability to subordinate that someone with PTSD suffers from. It's a numb camera style. And adding to the effect is the parade of monosyllables punctuated only by the intruding nouns: policeman, notebook, father, cigarette. I had kind of the same problem translating Sonala's novel Ice, which is set in 1973 Moscow, but it was published in 2011, but it really has the vibe of the early 1970s when he began to write it while actually resident in Moscow in the student dormitory of the All-Soviet Cinematography Institute. So to the fragmented dialogue and the lumbering parataxis, I added one thing which was already a little bit present in the original, which was the extreme foreignization of all the Soviet realia in the novel. So the narrator would be alienated indoors and out. And this is already true. You can see if you look at the Arabic, even if you don't read Arabic, that some words are bold-faced and followed by parentheses. That's the narrator aggressively foreignizing all of the Russian words present in the text. So I turned up the volume on that, and I also worked to find the right register to capture all of the Soviet kind of crap in this lived reality, such as we are fulfilling the plan forward toward communism, that the text dutifully reproduced, and to find the right tone for that. And so, unlike Tilka Raiha, Al-Jalid made no impact on the literary scene. It happened by coincidence to be published on January 25th, 2011. So as Sonala says, "Magech fi waqtiha." The Egyptian reading public had moved on. It was more interested in just, the beautiful things happening around, the uprising and its beautiful songs and stories and scenes of togetherness and public outrage, the images coming daily from Tahrir. So today, the situation is again more complicated. The trials of this year's, literally trials, of this year's Banipal Prize winning author, Ahmed Nagy, offer painful proof that Egyptian literature again faces real taboos. Posing as literary critics like some kind of upside-down literary prize jury, Nagy's attackers and judge focused on precisely the expressions he used in using life, even more than the subject matter he showed. And suddenly his lack of adab was a criminal offense. Its triggering of an affective physical response in a reader threatened national morality. Nagy described his charge as literally mukhalif al-adab al-aam. Imprisoned along with sex offenders and corrupt former police officers, he was both condemned for his art and denied any special status as an artist. But the postmodern writer's dilemma is where to go next. Aggressively ugly prose is no longer an obvious response to an ugly reality because the regime has gotten there first. In fact, Nagy was surprised to find a copy of Tilka Raiha in the prison library with the imprint of the Ministry of Culture, distributed by the prison's authority itself. So what else is programmatic ugliness? What else can uglification do when the regime has domesticated it too? So ugly prose can unmask hypocrisy, but it's less useful in confronting barefaced brutality. This is related to what I've called in writing about political theater, the problem of the naked emperor, when the child says the emperor has no clothes, but the emperor keeps sitting there on the throne, obscenely naked. Many Arabic writers today face brutality that is impervious to ridicule, immune to shame. No art can dislodge it. And anti-artistic art cannot even stand up to it. Only beauty can do that. It's precisely because of the power imbalance that images like this become iconic. They testify to the courage of the protester who puts a human, unmechanized body up against the whole machinery of regime power. They emphasize the body's vulnerability. They testify to the beauty of everyday life, the dignity of ordinary activities and people, and to the collective organizing and labor of the community that gives courage to the protester. They testify to a refusal to accept the state of exception and the logic of emergency. They show defiant beauty, sprouting even where it's incongruous or where it ultimately cannot survive. And of course, they put the fake promises, the fake aesthetics of politicians and developers to shame. Be it Solidaire rebuilding post-war downtown Beirut, or Russia promising to make Aleppo look as grand as Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, or any other top-down cleanup and beautification plans you may have heard about recently. Lone protesters, in the face of all that, know that they will likely suffer, but their brave and fragile appearance serves as a conscience, usually for the onlookers, rather than the enforcers, who are already too far gone. The protesters' moral beauty demands attention, recognition, protection, just as Elaine Scarry, in her nice little book on beauty and being just, says that a beautiful vase, inspires, yes, if it's beautiful, it's a vase, compels us to put it on a broad, safe shelf, and perhaps to extend that care to other, less beautiful vases as well. Beauty can be a spur towards social justice. Just as she says, it intensifies the pressure we feel to repair existing injuries. So here we start to see a role for beautiful writing as well. In his unduly luminous prose memoir, Memory for Forgetfulness, August, Beirut, 1982, Mahmoud Darwish rejects the idea that poets are required to speak out at times of mass killing. He says, "Sing if you wish, hold your tongue if you want. We're marginal in war. What's needed now is human commitment, not beauty and creative expression." But then he goes to Paris and sits and writes, and look what he does. He produces Memory for Forgetfulness itself, a stubbornly beautiful cry of love rather than war. He bothers famously to pen the most gorgeous prose poem about coffee ever written. He sings of a furtive wartime romantic tryst, and he pours out 100 words for water, quoting the 11th century Andalusi philologist Ibn Sina. The sheer beauty of this passage, the exuberance of its lexical excess, makes the simplest and most complex argument about war. Listen to me. I'm here, I have a history of culture, and I reject the logic of bare life. Because even when you light my sea on fire, I can plunge into the bottomless pool of the Arabic literary tradition. This is not escapism, it is something else. We're starting to see the value of speaking beauty to power. Let me move to a different, less famous example, which I also love. Egyptian novelist Mohammed Mansi Kandil's 2004 novel, Qamar ala Samarkand, Moon over Samarkand. Published in expurgated form, the reason I gave you the number of pages is because the first edition is like half the length. You can see it on the right. Published in very expurgated form by Egypt's Dar al-Hilal in 2004, the novel was then lusciously translated from a full manuscript by Jennifer Peterson for AUC Press, and then published in full by Dar Merit in 2005. And eventually Kandil's other book got nominated for a big prize, and so Dar al-Shuruq republished it in full in 2011. The novel's message, if I can do that, is about the resilience of Islamic humanism and the cost and the foolishness of nationalist government's secularist violence. It's set in Egypt and Central Asia, in modern and traditional cities, Cairo and Fayoum, Tashkent and Samarkand. Kandil weaves a vivid set of stories into the warp of a personal quest. So in the mid-1990s, a 40-something Egyptian man named Ali travels from Cairo, trying to explain the death of his father, to find an Uzbek military officer who had served in Egypt and stayed on after Sadat kicked out the Egyptian or the Soviet military advisors for the most part in 1972. And so he goes to find this man from a legendary land beyond an unknown river. His quest fails, but he acquires an alternative father figure, this wonderful character, the down-on-his-luck taxi driver named Nurallah, who eats like a bear, copulates like a bull, speaks Arabic like a classically trained man of God, which he is. As car trouble and woman trouble stretch their 180-mile journey from Tashkent to Samarkand into a multi-day epic, Moon over Samarkand becomes an exotic road trip novel, complete with the most picturesque landscapes of post-classical, what Shahab Ahmed called post-classical Islam, Islamic history and contemporary Central Asian life. Roma mechanics, dancing bears, hairbreadth flights from the police, a night at the tomb of Imam Bukhari, and a healing detour into Ali's disordered soul. But look at the prose. Kandil has said he writes historical novels because history offers him a refuge from the banality and randomness of the present. And so there's a set of elaborate inset stories. Every chapter ends with a kind of capstone quotation echoing the 1001 Nights, sounding like the voice that breaks Shahrazad's narrative at the end of every night. And here's how Ali pictures the journey of slave boys kidnapped in Central Asia to become the slave rulers, the Mamluk rulers of Egypt, one of whom might have been Nur Allah about 6 centuries earlier. Their faces are pallid, their extremities flushed with bluish blood from the tightness of the ropes. The slave traders walk ahead and hired guards surround the boys on all sides, flailing with whips whoever wavers or dares to fall behind. But those who survive this journey of eternal damnation find the Sultan's promised paradise on the banks of the Nile, and so forth, ending in this kind of moment that pulls you up short. They wear high collars that conceal the traces of the ropes the slave traders had tied around their necks. So Kandil knows exactly what he's doing with the beauty of his prose here. It's also true that this novel originated in a travelogue, and it bears the marks of that origin. After leaving Egypt in 1974, Kandil became a writer for the Kuwaiti magazine, Al Arabi, glossy Kuwait-based magazine that published a lot of travel writing, including by Mohammed Makhzangi and by Kandil himself. So he actually went in the early 1990s to rediscover what are these Muslim lands coming out from under Soviet rule. How is this flimsy socialist illusion giving way to first everlasting nature and then some kind of resurgence of a once lost paradise to be found in the great books of classical Islamic tradition? And so they go from the adjacent suburbs of Tashkent, rows of similar houses whose sky blue color lightened the grimness of their design, kind of Soviet kitsch, to suddenly that catalog that you see at the end of this passage, a glimpse of the lost paradise resting between the 2 rivers. That's how this land always appeared in the books of Islamic Turath. And here he comes into the kind of personal canon where you list the books most important to you. Writers usually do this with 19th century Russian literary classics, but here he's doing it with Islamic literature. Al-Tabari, Al-Bukhari, Ibn Sina, Tirmidhi, Farabi, Biruni, Khawarizmi, Samarkandi. Going back in time as well as space, this travelogue spills into the verdant fields of this personal canon. And when it grows into Moon over Samarkand, and here this is Osman's Quran that he also has a long lyrical detour about, you can see how it shows up the tawdriness and the temporary nature of contemporary dictatorships, be they Soviet, post-Soviet, or in fact Egyptian. And this was probably easy and fun to translate because the terrain is exotic to Kandil's reader too. And so it's easy for Peterson to slip in stealth glosses and other explanations to make its impact clear to the reader. And finally, really fast, the example I'm most preoccupied with now, an example of literary beauty in the face of military and political ugliness. I want to share a little bit from Khalil al-Riz's IPAF Shortly International Prize for Arabic Fiction shortlist novel, The Russian Quarter, Al-Hay al-Rusi. This is a sweet, quirky, and unexpectedly moving novel about the Syrian civil war, which in general has produced very little that is lovely in life or literature. It's set in a fictional neighborhood called the Russian Quarter, Al-Hay al-Rusi, inside a zoo where animals and humans coexist and interact. And the zoo is a diverse community. It houses the unnamed narrator and his Russian girlfriend Nonna, as well as a Russian former journalist named Viktor Ivanich, a bigamist teacher of French who is from Syria, the timid Russian pensioner Arkady Kuzmich, a mafioso named Bora, a local superhero named SM, a Moroccan oud player, 2 wolves, 3 eagles, a hyena, an Afghan hound named Raisa Petrovna, not President Petrovna, but actually Raisa in the Russian sense, and a poodle named Mustache. At the center is a giraffe who acquires a kind of mute prophetic power for the zoo community. So this is not a naive novel. It is, again, not escapist. The Russian Quarter's deliberate prose lovingly knits a self-contained magical realist world, but Rez also exposes that imaginary ecosystem to the blunt force of real violence. As the war between the Russian-backed Assad regime and Ghouta's extremist rebels moves inexorably closer, neither the zoo residents' courage nor their cowardice keeps them safe. When the violence floods in, it is like a crashing wave swamping a tide pool, whose colorful, delicate creatures the reader has unwittingly grown to love. Just to give you a glimpse of the style, this is the opening paragraph. On the roof of the zoo in the Russian Quarter, my 14-inch TV, balanced on its table near the giraffe's snout, was showing an archival soccer match between Spain and Uruguay. The rumble of nearby mortar fire had not stopped since early morning. My tea had gone cold, waiting for the apple fritters baked by Denis Petrovich, the clarinet teacher at the Higher Institute of Music, as I sprawled next to the giraffe, watching tiny black and white goals filmed in Madrid 50 years ago. The artillery was shelling neighboring Ghouta from the orchards of the Russian Quarter. And so on. You can hear the rhythmic flow of these sentences in my translation. They're one long paragraph, a sustained, sinuous thought. And you can see I added the word balance to suggest that the television has been brought up recently on the roof, perhaps to facilitate giraffine viewing. And the paragraph juxtaposes the ongoing civil war with the narrator's tea. The Russian Quarter was written in transit as Khalil Raz fled from war-torn Syria through Turkey and Greece in 2015. Eventually to Belgium, he finished it in a refugee shelter in Brussels. One would have expected a work of great urgency from that production context, perhaps something like two works that Max Weiss translated, such as Samar Yazbek's A Woman in the Crossfire, Dunya Mikhail's The Beekeeper. But the Russian Quarter reads nothing like a news dispatch. It keeps everything in subordinate clauses. The war is on the back burner. It's on like a black and white TV on mute, playing in the background, as the prose proceeds at Proustian leisure. Another charming feature are the animals. They're not charming and cartoonish like in Kalila Wadimna. They're more like Andrei Kurkov's penguin or bees. They're real animals, but they're sort of the conscience of the text. They're silent. They're not silent. The dogs bark and stuff like that, but they're wordless, and they're deeply sensitive, portrayed with great empathy. So this is part of a beautiful book. And Khalil set out to do this on purpose. For him, ugliness is boring. He wants to offer the reader something different. He says Napoleon's invasion of Russia was an ugly subject for Tolstoy's beautiful novel, War and Peace. The destruction of the town of Guernica was an ugly subject for Picasso's beautiful painting. In short, Khalil refuses to let his life circumstances either dominate his art or explain it. He values the autonomy of the artist above all. And rather than rebel against the strictures of traditional Arabic adab or embrace them, he just sidesteps that whole issue entirely. He sidesteps the whole Arabic novel, I think, writing a world novel that just happens to be in Arabic. And it's no accident that he's chosen Tolstoy and Picasso for the models he wants to cite for his imaginary peers. So I told you, it's not an escapist novel. Close to the end, a car bomb explodes at the zoo gate. There's an incredible passage, which I can't read to you because it would take like 3 minutes to read, of all the stuff that they see, all the rubble and litter and clutter and debris. And finally, the quarter's inhabitants follow through Ghouta. They follow the giraffe on a kind of procession, which may or may not be a protest, and they end up in Umayyad Square in Damascus. And here the text spills out into a story of a neighborhood that's pretending there's no war at all. What war? In Umayyad Square, a Russian-made T-90 tank rolls toward the procession, which is headed by the giraffe. This is the same model that was used in Russia's wars in Dagestan and Donbass, now confronting the ragtag giraffe-led group in Damascus. And Khalil told me he began writing the book with this scene of the giraffe confronting the tank. It's a compelling image, the lone moral being, in this case mute, embracing and deploying its fragility in the face of brute power. You can see the connection to the images of lone protesters that we saw earlier. Beauty is a basic human need, as physical as basic a need as oxygen. A US journalist named Andrea Lee went and spent some months in Moscow in the late 1970s, and she reported people staring obsessively against the gray background at a beautiful face, a well-cut dress, even like a well-designed piece of stationery. So intense was their hunger for beauty. Ahmed Nagy spends his memoir pursuing literature and taking refuge in it, escaping the stench and monotony of his cell. And at the end, in the final vignette, his book manuscript unfurls, in Katharine's beautiful word, from its casing of, excuse me, shit. A similar thing happens in the recently published Tale of a Wall by the long-serving Palestinian prisoner Nasser Abu Sroor, movingly translated by two-time Banipal winner Luke Leifgren. The character called Nanna represents beauty and discusses beauty with the prisoner, which basically keeps him sane. So, why is beauty such a rare topic in Arabic literature, in courses and journals and translations? And what should the narrator do about it? I'm not so much worried about the thing Elaine Scarry says, which is that the beauty of this beautiful object may compel you to save it and neglect others. I think this is an irrelevant critique for the translator. Our time is short, and to translate a book, to let it move me to tears or to goosebumps, to take it into my body and make it speak with my tongue, this is a very personal decision that, you know, like other intimate choices, should not be subjected to a critique of, well, how come you prefer this over that? I don't think that's it at all. One's only obligation in that regard is to train and mentor a lot of emerging younger translators who can translate a broad variety of whatever moves them so that it can move readers in turn. I'm happy with that response. The other critique of beauty that hits a little harder in the Arabic context is the history of Orientalization of everything Arab. Islamic and Arabic culture have been much Orientalized, feminized, archaized, dismissed as ornamental and merely decorative, treated as an object of the Western gaze rather than a subject of its own history. And when you hear about a beautiful vase on the shelf calling on you to protect it, on some level, you probably imagine some beautiful ceramic in a case at the British Museum, or some Muslim woman who needs saving. Neither one is speaking for itself. So I think the beauty and the challenge of our work as translators is that the justice we are looking for involves listening, not saving. In an ethically and geopolitically charged context, the challenge is how to maintain beauty's ability to shock, how to not make the translation so gorgeous, so smooth, that the reader will be lulled into thinking that they've read it before. This method of doing this will be different for every book, but English has the resources to do that, and I believe it's worth paying attention and thinking about how. Those of us over the age of 40 should also remember that the audience for translated Arabic literature has changed. Maybe pedestalization is no longer the biggest concern. For instance, my students were born after September 11th. Their stereotypes of the Middle East and the Arab world they've heard of it stereotyped as a place of terror, not a place of leisure and pleasure. And translations that reclaim and recenter the intricate play of ornament and desire, things like Yasmin Seal's ongoing work with the 1001 Nights. This might be exactly what the doctor ordered. Also, due to mass displacement from the Arab world and to the dominance of English in elite education, even inside Arab countries, it may be true that some of our English readers are Arabs. They have Arab backgrounds, they know Arab culture, but they may prefer to read in English. And for those people, it's ironic and it's incredibly moving to see our teaching and translation work give them access to the beauties of their own culture. I've seen this happen even recently. I taught a very inappropriate to this topic class on war in Arabic literature at Boston University. And even there, a student who's studying to be a dermatologist came and said, I had no idea that these beautiful things were in my culture. To feed these young people only on their grandparents' bitterness seems perverse and sterile, when Mahmoud Darwish's cardamom coffee is what will actually jolt them awake. So, yes, this. So to conclude, I'm not arguing that literary beauty will have any political effect, that it'll succeed better than programmatic ugliness did, that it can fight either kitschy neoliberal beautification or outright brutality. Between words and the sword, my least favorite anagram in English, the sword will always win. But I do think that if the Arabic to English translator wants a principled role in today's, yes, very dark times, it is this: to embrace the exquisite vulnerability of everything worth fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was quite insightful and very interesting topic, and there's plenty to talk about. It's so engaging. Thank you so much. And we now continue with our second part of the evening, where we celebrate the Banipal Prize, Saif Ghobash Banipal Prize for Arabic Literature, translation, which was awarded this year to Katharine Halls for her translation of Rotten Evidence by Ahmed Naji and published by McSweeney's. The judging panel of this year were comprised of Raphael Cohen and Michael Keynes and Laura Watkins and Nariman Youssef. Just a quick introduction about the translator. Katharine is an Arabic to English translator from Cardiff. Her translation of Ahmed Naji's prison memoir, Rotten Evidence, was shortlisted for the National Book Circle Critics Circle Award for her memoir and autobiography in the US. She was awarded in 2021 the Penn Translation Fund grant to translate Haytham al-Wardani's short story collection, Things That Can't Be Fixed. She translated so many works, among them Rajal Alam's Dove's Necklace with Adam Talib, 2017, which received the Sheikh Hamad Award for translation and was shortlisted for 2017 Saif Ghobash Banipal Prize for Arabic Literature Translation. And we also welcome Raphael Cohen. He's a translator, a friend, quite prolific, and amazing, with amazing translations of Amir Taj al-Sir and Ahlam Mustaghani, Muhammad Salamawi and Ahmed Bursi and Mona Prince. And he's came from all the way from Cairo, so he's been living there for 2006. So we welcome Katharine and Raphael on the stage for a conversation. And after that, we'll welcome also Professor Wen-chin Ouyang for a Q&A, and we'll open it to the floor after half an hour. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm a member of the Banipal Trust. My name is Samira Qawar, and I'm going to read to you an extract from the winning work, Rotten Evidence. I'm going to read it in Arabic, following which I think Katharine will read her English translation. So here goes. تطبيق العظام. بعد 3 أسابيع من دخولك وجدت رفيق المعيشة المناسب. من الصعب أن يحيا المرء وحيداً في السجن، لذا تختار كل مجموعة يتآلف بعضها مع بعض أن تتشارك في المعيشة. مثلاً، كان لدينا نقص دائم في الخضروات والفاكهة، وفي بيئة غير صحية كالسجن هناك ضرورة لتناول هذه العناصر الغذائية. في حالتي كنت أتلقى زيارة من الأهل كل أسبوعين يحضرون الخضروات والفاكهة من ضمن ما يحضرونه، لكن بسبب الرطوبة والحر فالخضار يفسد خلال أيام ولا يمكن تخزينه في الثلاجة لأن الثلاجة مخصصة للحوم والفراخ. بتشاركك المعيشة مع شخص أو أكثر تتقاسمون الطعام، بهذا يضمن كل فرد من المجموعة توفر الطعام الطازج طوال أيام الأسبوع. يسكن رفيقي مصلباً مجاوراً لي. جميع المصالب في عنابرنا مبنية من الخرسانة المسلحة والإسمنت، وبين مصلبي ومصلبه حاجز إسمنتي بارتفاع 10 سنتيمترات كنا نضع عليه كرتونة تحتوي على علب السكر والقهوة والشاي والنسكافيه، إلى جانب بعض قطع البسكوت أحيانا وكتبي. أما أوراقي والكراس الذي أكتب فيه روايتي فكنت أضعه أسفل المرتبة التي أنام عليها على ضوء اللمبة، حيث أقرأ ترجمة عربية لرواية أطفال منتصف الليل لسلمان رشدي. يسهر رفيقي الليلة وهو يكتب على ورق فولسكاب خطابات طويلة من صفحات متعددة، يكتب بالقلم الأزرق وأحيانا يخرج قلم التصحيح الأبيض يهزه ويمسح حرفا خطأ أو جملة ندم على كتابتها. كان لديه شغف جنوني بكتابة الخطابات، وكنت أحسده على قدرته الجسدية على الكتابة لفترات طويلة بهذا الشكل. لطالما كانت لدي مشكلة مع إمساك القلم والكتابة لفترات طويلة. في الامتحانات كنت أحيانا أكتب إجابات مختصرة عن الأسئلة، لا أكتب كل ما أعرفه لأن يدي متعبة. منذ المراهقة بدأت في كتابة قصصي ويومياتي على الكمبيوتر، وبعد التخرج هجرت الورقة والقلم تماما. والآن في السجن كنت أتعلم من جديد كيفية إمساك القلم وكيفية الكتابة على الورقة المسطرة. أولاً تمكنا أنا وشريكي من شراء عدد قديم من مجلة زهرة الخليج، وهي مجلة اجتماعية ذات طباعة إماراتية فاخرة. كنا نستخدمها كمسند للكتابة، نضعها فوق الفاصل الخرساني بين المصلبين، ثم نضع الورقة عليها ونكتب. كان يحفظ أوراق رسائله داخل صفحات المجلة. هو أقصر مني، لذا كان بإمكانه الكتابة في هذا الوضع. أما أنا فبعد 5 دقائق كنت أشعر بعظام وعضلات ظهري تصرخ من الألم. جربت الاستناد بظهري على الجدار ووضع مجلة زهرة الخليج على فخذي مع ثني الركبتين، وكان هذا أفضل وضع للكتابة وصلت له. قسمت فترات الكتابة حتى لا تشعر بالإرهاق سريعا. تكتب فقرة ثم تفرد جسمك حتى لا تفاجئك عظامك وقد طبقت وأغلقت على عضلاتك. ركبتك تطقطق، وفي الليل توقظك آلام الركبة بسبب البرد والرطوبة والنوم غير المريح. تفرد ساقك فلا تستطيع فردها كاملة لأنك أطول من المصلب. تظل ساهرا تخاطب الألم لعله يزول فتنام، وفي الصباح تؤلمك مع كل حركة. تضغط على أسنانك متحملا آلام الركبة المثنية بينما تكتب بالقلم الجاف على الورقة مستندا إلى فخذك. لكل كلمة كتبتها في هذا الوضع داخل السجن ألمها وجهدها. لتكن هذه حياتك إذن أيها الكاتب. درب نفسك على هذه الممارسة، هكذا ستكون حياتك، فاستعد لاستخدامها.
Thanks, Samira, for that wonderful reading. I will now read the same chapter in English. It's called Folding Bones. 3 weeks in, I found a buddy. It's hard to get by alone in prison. For example, we never had enough fruit and vegetables, and in an environment as unhealthy as that, you need your vitamins. I got a visit from my family every 2 weeks when they'd bring fruit and vegetables, among other things. But in the heat and humidity, they went bad within days, and I couldn't keep them in the refrigerator because the refrigerator was reserved for meat. By buddying up with somebody else or a group of people, you could share your food deliveries and that way guarantee that everyone in the group would have fresh food throughout the week. My buddy, HB, occupied the bunk next to mine. The bunks in the cell block were made of reinforced concrete and separated from one another by a concrete block about 10 centimetres high. On the divider between our bunks, we kept a cardboard box where we stored packets of sugar, coffee, tea, Nescafe, and sometimes cookies. Next to this box were my books. I kept my papers and writing notebooks under the mattress. By the light of the same jerry-rigged bulb, under which I read the Arabic translation of Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, my body stayed up late writing long, multi-page letters in blue ink on a legal pad, now and then taking out a corrector pen which he rattled before erasing a mistake or a line he'd thought better of. His letter-writing habit was obsessive, and I envied his physical ability to write for hours on end. I've always struggled to hold a pen and write for long periods, and in school exams I often wrote short, summary answers instead of putting down everything I knew, just because my hand got tired. As a teenager, I started writing short stories and journals on a computer, and after graduating from university, I abandoned pen and paper completely. In prison, I had to learn all over again how to grip a pen and write by hand on lined paper. This was how our setup worked. First, my buddy and I managed to buy an old copy of Gulf Flower, an upscale, well-produced Emirati society magazine that was perfect for leaning on as we wrote. We used to keep it on the concrete divider between our bunks, and he also stored the many pages of his letters inside it. Being shorter than me, he could write leaning on the divider, but when I tried, every bone and muscle in my back hurt within minutes. By experimenting, I found it easiest to sit with my back to the wall, my knees bent, and Gulf Flower resting on my thighs. This was how I wrote. I divided my writing sessions so as not to tire myself out too quickly. After one paragraph, I'd stretch and shake out my body so it wouldn't suddenly seize up on me. My knees began to click, and in the night I was sometimes awoken by the pain, caused by the cold and damp and the uncomfortable bed. Whenever I tried to stretch out, my legs hit the end of the bunk because I was too tall. I would stay awake, talking to the aches in my body, hoping they would go away so I could fall back asleep. In the morning, every movement would hurt, and I'd grip my teeth against the pain in my bent knees as I sat down again with my ballpoint pen and my notebook resting on my thighs. Every word I wrote in that awkward, tiring position carries the ache and the effort it cost me. This is what it is to be a writer, I thought. Practice it. This is your life. Be prepared to use it.
No? Yep. Well, thank you very much, Samira and Katharine, for reading. Katharine, of course, I'd like to congratulate you, first of all, on winning the Saif Ghobash Banipal Prize for Arabic Literature 2024. Clearly, from your reading, from the passage which Katharine just read, I hope that you can get a sense of the naturalness of the voice, the flow of the language, and I think that I'll come on and talk a little about your translation strategies later on, but one of the things the judges recognised was really the sheer quality of the translation. It's not an easy text necessarily. Arabic. Katharine, I'd like you to talk perhaps a little about how you came to translate the work. What was the process? Did you know Nagy? Did you know the publishers? Were you commissioned? If you could just give us an idea about how that worked.
Sure. I think because you began with congratulations, I will also just begin with some thanks. I want to say thank you again to everybody at Banipal, not only for this prize, but for everything they've done for Arabic literature in English over the years. And it's very sad that the magazine is no longer. I don't know if my stepdad remembers, but he bought me a subscription to Banipal when I was about, I think, 18, and I had that for many years, and it was really important for me in my kind of education in Arabic literature and also in my decision to become a translator. So thank you, Banipal. And thank you so much to the Ghobash family who've, made this prize possible. At a time when public funding for the arts is in such short supply and also very often comes with strings attached, particularly where I live and work in Germany. It's really wonderful to see generous people choosing to patronise the arts. So I'm really, really grateful to them. And thank you to you as, judge, jury, and the other colleagues who were on the judging panel. I'm really honoured that they saw fit to give me this award. So thank you very much. to your question then, yeah, I knew Ahmed Nagy himself. We have many friends in common, and I even know some of the characters in the book that put him in prison. So I've heard the backstories about some of the things that got written about.
I'm actually curious. It's not. I mean, the suggestion is that this is a random citizen who had heart palpitations, but the book suggests that there was much more of a conspiracy involving the man who took over the editorship of Akhbar al-Adab.
We're getting deep into gossip already. I'm going to start with your first question. So I knew Ahmed Nagy, and I was aware of his writing. It had a really loyal following. Ahmed writes, I mean, the fiction that he writes is kind of quite dystopian and absurd. And I hadn't actually read any of it, but it had, he has real fans in Egypt. And then then the trial happened, and I was really aware of that, and I was really aware of the whole story. Then he got out of prison, he moved to the USA, he wrote this book, and the book came out, I mean, it did really well at the 2020 Cairo Book Fair. Now, at that time, we were all just going into lockdown, and suddenly we had loads of time on our hands to read. So I read the book, and I really loved it. And I thought, wow, this book should really be translated. So I started working on it that summer, in fact. And Ahmed by then was living in Vegas, of all places. And he had he'd met lots of people and made lots of contacts in the literary world over there in California. And some of those people were the people at McSweeney's, who also have a magazine called The Believer, which is a really great magazine for non-fiction writing. And they published an excerpt from the book, which I translated. And then we were thrilled when, I forget when it was exactly, but it was about, I think, a year afterwards, they decided that they'd like to publish the book in English. So that was how that came about.
So McSweeney's were really they were involved from the beginning.
Yeah, and Ahmed was the one who knew them. I had actually sent this book, pitched it to tons and tons of publishers, but in the end, it was one of Ahmed's contacts that led to it being published at McSweeney's, which was really nice.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite unusual for such a high-profile publisher to take on an Arabic translation.
Yeah, I'm not sure they've published much translated stuff before. I certainly don't think they've published anything translated from Arabic, but they also have another magazine called McSweeney's for, literary fiction, and they've just published a whole special issue translated from Arabic, which is dedicated to Syria, called Aftershocks. That just came out in December, amazingly 3 days after the fall of the Assad regime. So I'd really recommend people read that as well. That has an excerpt from the book that Margaret just mentioned by Khalil al-Riz, The Russian Quarter, alongside loads of other wonderful Syrian writers. So they've been, I think, partly through their contact with Ahmed Nagy, been getting more and more interested in Arabic literature.
Okay, well, that's very good to hear. So perhaps we could turn back to the dynamics of how Ahmed ended up in prison. And it, in a way, I mean, in her lecture, Professor Litvin talked about the connection between adab meaning manners and adab meaning literature. And Ahmed Nagy wrote his infamous chapter, which appeared before the book had been published, in Akhbar al-Adab, the literary review, and went on to be accused of, we use in Arabic, but a lot of illit adab. So he suggests in the work that it was brought about by a problem with the man who'd been brought in by the new regime in 2012, the Muslim Brotherhood under Morsi, the state publishers who control Akhbar al-Adab. They put in a man to run it, a Mani, I believe, whose name escapes me, and that he is behind. I think the book suggests that. Is that correct?
I'm not going to make myself any enemies in the Egyptian literary scene, so I won't talk too much about that. But I will say that after the military coup, after 1,000 protesters were murdered in the streets of Egypt, and the military got rid of the Brotherhood government, there followed a period in which I think it was very important for the sort of supposedly secular or non-Islamist, non-Brotherhood government to establish the moral authority that they had. And that was a sort of one of the kind of big dynamics in the background to what happened here. You can, I mean, Ahmed's account of what happened at Akhbar al-Adab and the ins and outs of the trial is one of the really interesting things about the book. And there is a lot of great gossip in there. But I think, that's one of the main things I think that was happening at the time. But I should say this had never happened before. No author of fiction had ever gone to prison for morality crimes in Egypt before. I think that bears saying because, people in Europe might have an image of, the Middle East as being a very conservative place. But there's all sorts of sex scenes in Arabic literature all over the place. There's all sorts of homosexuality. There's all sorts of everything. You can find everything. So for somebody to go to prison for a sex scene was really extremely out of the ordinary.
Yeah, I mean, the book's never been banned. It seems to me that he went to prison under the regime post 2013. He wasn't put in prison by the Ikhwan.
Muslim Brotherhood, yeah, correct.
He makes that pretty clear that the real people who were putting him in prison were not some editor or some random citizen, but the regime itself for issues of, many issues perhaps. Obviously, as a fellow translator, I absolutely love the translation, and I looked very closely to see what you've done. So before we talk about the book as a whole, which I think is a more complicated topic in some ways, just when you're dealing with a paragraph, for example, what's your approach? How do you go about working? Because there seems something which is, there's nothing very formulaic or cliched about the way you translate, which I find is a problem that, you get the meaning of a word, an Arabic word, and you always translate it the same way. And I was really surprised by just how fresh the translation was. So perhaps you could say a bit about your creative process.
Thanks. That's a lovely comment to receive and a nice question as well. I usually read the books that I'm going to translate several times before I get started on them. And usually, even from the first time when I'm reading them, I have a pen or a pencil in hand and I will start making notes in the margins about how I think particular words or scenes or sentences or whatever should be translated. Things will start to suggest themselves. And it's very important for me during that stage to think about the author's voice because, AI can translate a string of words, but that's not very fun to read. Only somebody with an author's sensibility can think about voice and can try to recreate that voice in another language. How exactly on a practical level I go about doing that will depend then on the voice in question. Sometimes you find yourself, flicking through the dictionary for hours. Sometimes you don't even need to look in the dictionary. Sometimes you really want to vary the vocabulary you use. Sometimes it's just all there ready. I actually did read some prison literature in English when I was thinking about translating this. Some of them I had to put down because they were so horrible. This book is very funny and very witty, and a lot of it's quite upbeat. So sort of a grim, miserable, very sort of philosophical voice wasn't going to work. So there was, you can see it's quite kind of, a lot of it feels quite vernacular. It feels like, talking to somebody. And I think that's one of the really lovely things about Ahmed Nagy's writing. It's so witty and it's so him, and it's him being rude and sarcastic about people. So I had that a lot in mind when I was translating, how to kind of conjure up this sarcastic conversational voice.
Yeah, I think you succeeded very well in doing that. How much intervention kind of on the linguistic level as opposed to on the formal level or the structural level did McSweeney's put in? Did you gave them a manuscript and they went through, or they reworked it with you? What was their editorial? Because I believe that they have quite strong editorial presence generally with the people that write for them, their authors.
Yeah. This was a very multi-stage process. So, as I said, before we knew that McSweeney's were going to publish this book, Ahmed and I had already agreed that I was going to translate it. And I'd started work and I'd created, I'd come up with a long sample, many chapters long. And we'd actually already begun making some edits ourselves. I remember the very last scene in the book, we'd already sort of switched some paragraphs around, for example. So there was already a fair bit of that. And then I suppose the biggest thing that came up once we started working with our editor, Daniel Gambina at McSweeney's, who is also an author himself. You're quite right. They're very kind of attentive editors there, because I think pretty much everyone who works there writes their own stuff and really cares about the language and, the substance of the books. So one of the biggest sort of tasks we had on our hands was to start shifting around some of the order of the chapters, because the novel is non-chronological. It jumps back and forth, not only within Ahmed's life. There are kind of flashbacks to his childhood and the authors that he loved when he was a child and what it was like sitting in the school library. But there's also kind of jumping around within the process of the trial and his time in prison itself. And I mean, this was a very high-profile case in Egypt. So if you were an Egyptian reader, that wouldn't bother you because you knew what happened in the case and you knew most of the ins and outs of it. But if you hadn't followed the case in detail and you were a new reader who didn't know very much about what Ahmed had been through, it would be really, really hard to follow something that was that non-chronological. So we thought, okay, let's tidy this up a bit. We added a timeline at the front. You'll see that's not in the Arabic. And there are a couple of actually new sections that just explained a little bit more detail about how the case worked, because it was very complicated. There were appeals and they had to go back and forth and they were fined. And then, only at the very end did he end up going to prison, and then there was an appeal. So it was all very complicated. So we wanted to simplify that a lot. And so we did, and that will account for, no doubt, you've noticed the many changes in order. They're Americans, of course, so they changed lots of my Britishisms. The word cookies that I just read was not my word. I would never say cookies, I'd say biscuits.
Get the final editorial. You didn't see the final manuscript and say, no, I won't have that?
I did. I don't mind. I mean, it's for an American audience. They're an American publisher. This book, I mean, although you can buy the book here, which is wonderful, it's not actually out in the UK. It will be in a year and a half, I think. And I will get the biscuits back in for the UK and Ireland edition. But no, I didn't mind at all having Americanisms in there. You have to, the reader has to be able to connect with it in the language that they understand. So that was fine. And then there were lots of kind of language level edits. Daniel was very attentive. And I should also say that Ahmed himself is a really open-minded and cooperative writer. And I think maybe you can kind of see that from the stuff he talks about in the book, because he's always talking about how he never really felt he was a writer, but then he learned to call himself a writer while he was in prison. And we just did an interview with to celebrate the book winning the prize, which came out today. It's on the McSweeney's website. And even there, he talks about how he's still becoming a writer now that he's moved to the USA, and he's also beginning to write in English, and he's just done an MFA, which he hadn't done at the time he wrote this. So he is always looking for ways that he can change and improve his text, and he's really excited about that. So, every time I suggested something or Daniel suggested something, he would consider it really kind of open-mindedly and quite often say, yeah, let's do that. That really works. Or maybe not that, but how about this? So it was really fun and very kind of, it was a really nice collaborative process.
Yeah, I mean, just to reinforce what you're saying, I mean, saw myself as a writer, and this is a man who's written 2 novels before he'd gone to prison. The one, I mean, Istihdam al-Haya is his second novel. And then he goes on to give more, perhaps a somewhat more feel of the style of the translation. Until I went to prison, I never saw myself as a writer. Occasional journalist, day labourer in the media market, often unemployed intellectual masturbator, 3-legged chair, daydreamer, mental adolescent, but writer? Not sure. I was only 30, I hadn't decided what I wanted yet, and I didn't see any reason why I should. and there are many passages which have that tone, I would say.
I think that also gives you an idea of his humility as well. I think readers who'd read his first novels might not have imagined him as humble, because they're really kind of out there, and he's quite a bombastic presence on social media. But he's such a humble person as a writer, and I think that really comes across in passages like this.
I'd also, to open up that question, I'd like to read you just another short bit. This follows a critique, fairly scathing critique of prison literature. But Nagy writes, literature exists unto itself. Its essence lies in its singularity, not in its expository abilities, and it's from works of literature that writers learn their craft. In a work of literature, form is central. Indeed, form and content are one. That's what makes the work. So I'd like us to think a little bit about the actual form of written evidence, because it's quite interesting that the way, it's divided into, 20, 30, perhaps more named chapters, many of which are, recount some event in prison, or something about the trial, or some thoughts about literature, often about literature. And then there are dated sections which are italicized in the English text. I believe they're italicized. Smaller form. So day 131, and the date, and then often sometimes dreams, about dreams, sometimes an incident in the prison. How does that work? What's the manuscript which presumably lies behind this, which was written in prison and is a prison memoir or a prison diary? Did that exist?
I don't think it existed in complete form. He talks about it in the book, being very disciplined about making sure he wrote every day, because he didn't really have anything else to do in prison. So he sat down and wrote every day. He was also working on a novel, and he talks at great length about how that novel turned out to be a total failure. He sort of thought he had a lot of fun writing it in prison, and then when he sat down to redraft it outside of prison, he was like, "This is terrible. This isn't going to work." And I don't think that one ever, made it out of draft stage. But he wanted to write every day, and so he kept this diary. It's not absolutely completely reproduced here. I think there are, diary entries that we never saw, that never made it into the Arabic original. But they're very immediate. They're about sort of very, very quick observations he makes about what's happening around him, things that he's experiencing, often quite physical, the tiredness, they're fed really disgusting food, and they have to kind of supplement it with their own stuff that's brought in from outside. And it's all of these, very immediate observations, whereas a lot of the named chapters are much more thought through, and you can see he's applied a sort of analysis afterwards to make sense of his experience, both in prison and also before, because he talks a lot about the writers that inspired him and the books that he read while he was in prison, and how they've all kind of fed into his thinking and to the way he writes.
Yeah, it is a very rich book in that sense. It's full. There's really full of lots of different elements. I was quite surprised. One big change that you made in terms of the structure of the book is that there's this scene which comes very early on in the Arabic, page 37 in the Arabic, page 231 in the English, of this manuscript being excreted from the rectum. Is that true? Is that?
Yeah, but all of this is so, like I said, so unchronological and has been shuffled around. I can't give you a definitive answer on whether or not that is true, but you can ask Ahmed. It's very graphic.
Have you asked Ahmed?
I just assumed it was true. It didn't occur to me to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I may well be true. It's the placement. It's its placement in the text, and there are other places where it might have made more sense. Particularly after there's a long chapter where he talks about a character he names Proust, who's written a 7-notebook long account of his time in prison.
It's heartbreaking because, well, can I spoil it for you? Proust writes, the guy called Proust writes down every detail of what happens to him in prison. I woke up at 7:30 this morning. I made a cup of coffee. I drank my cup of coffee. Then I went for a shower. I used the soap. And then when he gets out of prison, the guard, the sergeant on duty says, I can't let you take this stuff out with you. You'll have to burn it. So his entire life's work is burnt before he leaves prison. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, and clearly that might well have had an impact on the way that Ahmed Nagy was thinking about his own literary production from prison. Yeah. Isn't it famously Son Allah who smuggled his texts out?
And also Ala Abdel Fattah, who's in prison, is just about still managed to write things, and his family is smuggling them out while he's in prison. So.
Okay. I mean, Son Allah Ibrahim does have quite an important foil for Nagy in the book, because he holds Son Allah up as a committed writer who had an ideology, went to prison with his comrades, whereas he is, to all intents and purposes, on his own, although he obviously forms a community in prison. But he says at the end of his life, or as he got older, Son Allah said, literature isn't about commitment anymore. Literature is about pleasure. Do you think that's Ahmed Nagy's position? Literature is about pleasure, about pleasing. There's a chapter about pleasing himself. I want to actually read you again, just a section.
It's very intimidating being asked such detailed questions, because I finished this book about 3 years ago. It's receded into the mists of time. I can't remember why I translated certain words certain way, or put certain paragraphs on certain pages.
So he says, my real transgression, this is in response to the judgment, my real transgression was to have deliberately ignored the values and mores of Egyptian society, which I freely admit I've always hated and despised. I had taken every available opportunity to spit on its values and piss on its mores, and I'd shit on the whole damn thing if I could. And I was happy to say that my writing certainly didn't aim to elevate the nation or foster morals and manners. I wanted to encourage people to take a good look at this thing we call the nation, to think long and hard about it, and if that meant they might want to run as far away from it as they could, or burn it to the ground, then so be it. I didn't have anything to offer to society. I just found that writing was a way of knowing and understanding myself, and a way of getting to know you, whoever you are, you who are reading this now. But do you think he's also becoming more engaged? I mean, his nihilism is becoming more. I mean, maybe he's in a position now where he can actually say what he likes about Egypt.
I think certainly in the USA, he is finding that he feels he has to speak out about lots of things which, the US public don't necessarily like to hear. So that's a whole other really interesting kind of set of questions for us to ask him when we get the chance. But he is a very non-dogmatic person, and he spends a lot of time in this book really railing against sort of ideologically motivated writers, prison writers in particular, who put their ideology or the party line before the experiences of the people around them. And I think for Ahmed, the priority is the human, the relationships he built with people, his self-knowledge and his understanding of himself, as he talks about in that paragraph that you just read, and a relationship built between the author and the writer, between the author and the reader.
We need to move to the next session.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, not the words. I think we'll continue the discussion now with Q&A.
Okay.
With you, of course, Raphael. It's also about the judging process and Also, we look forward to have Professor Wen-chin Ouyang and Margaret Litvin, as possible. Yeah, that's
Shall we sort of start with the floor, or do you want me to warm up a little bit?
warming up.
Yeah? Anybody? Anybody? All right. Warm up a little bit? Okay. Okay. So let me think. So all three of you are translators. Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to shift the question to very general questions and ask three translators to tell us something, right? One is your selection process. How do you select the works that you want to translate? So I want to hear you, and then I have a follow-up question. All right, shall we start with the first speaker, Margaret, because Margaret has translated many works as well. So selection process. Do you select? Do you have a choice, or?
I've translated only a couple of works because I have a day job as a professor. They select me because I hear them speaking in English in my head as I read. The thing that Katharine just described of you read it and phrases suggest themselves and you scrawl them in the margins has actually happened to me, even with quite different books that are quite different from each other, but I can hear them speaking English through me. And I feel that they have my name on them and I need to translate them. And that's how it happens.
Tells us this is Margaret.
In my case, it has grown out of my research. So first I was writing a dissertation and then a book on Arabic Shakespeare, Arabic appropriations of Shakespeare's Hamlet. And so I found myself translating a couple of Arabic Hamlet adaptations by Mamdouh Hadoyan and Jawad al-Asadi, because why should the reader take my word for it when these plays are so great? Why should they read me when they could in fact read the sources for themselves through me? And the same thing with the novels, where I translated Sonal Ibrahim's Al-Jalid because I was researching a very long gestating book on Arab-Soviet cultural relations and their literary legacies. And then, of course, Khalil Raz, who I met through the Arab-Soviet connection. And then I was like, oh my God, no one has actually ever written anything like this. And it also needs to speak English.
Are you selected works, or do you select them?
Yeah, I liked how you put that. I think I'm definitely still learning my own tastes. I try to read quite widely in Arabic, but I definitely am attracted to a younger generation of Arab writers. I was very lucky to translate the first book I translated with Adam Talib was the winner of the 2011 IPAF, Raja Alam. And that was a wonderful first experience. But since then, I've found that, the books that I'm translating are very rarely the ones that win big international prizes. They're quite often ones that have got attention in small literary circles in their home countries, or in kind of magazines and book clubs and so on, but not the kind of big hitting names that are perhaps more known to the establishment. And I put quite a lot of effort into that because given that Anglophone publishers know so little about what's happening in contemporary Arabic writing, they're very often attracted to those big prizes, the ones that win, the International Prize for Arabic Fiction or one of the big Gulf-based prizes. And those books are great, but they're not the only thing that's happening in contemporary Arabic writing. So I'm not the only one doing this by any means. There are other translators out there who are, looking for books that are a bit more under the radar, younger writers, perhaps only known in some of the smaller countries that don't often make it onto the West's radar.
Well, I also have a day job, which is being a translator. So mostly the translation finds me rather than me finding the translation. But I've become less happy about that. Really, I want to translate the things which really move me and the things that I feel that speak to me. And I've got one novel that I'd really like to translate. And that's more about what it's about than it's a novel about Luxor, which is not. I think it's I think it would be good to translate. It's so you know, and I agree with what Katharine said about developing taste. I think it's very difficult for for us to develop a real taste for, you know, what's exceptional or what's really, but, you know, what speaks to us, I suppose, would be the criteria for me.
Are you guys warm yet? Or shall I follow up with another question? Yeah, one question? Okay. Speaking of taste and voice, right? And when you translate, right, what do you pay the most attention to? And I can tell you about sort of what I do. I'm a sort of amateur translator. I translate occasionally for friends. And one thing that
That's excessively modest. You also publish your translations. People like to.
Thank you. But what obsesses me the most is really the pace and rhythm of the prose, the music of the prose, right? And I heard Katharine, you say about voice, sort of works that speak to you. Look for the voice of the author. Margaret, you know, you said, you said the same thing. The text select you part of your research, right? What about you, Raphael? So I'm going to turn around and start from you, Raphael. What is it that obsesses you when you're translating from Arabic into English?
Well, understand the original text to begin with. That's the thing which obsesses me.
But aside of that, does the artistry of it?
Well, obviously, I want to produce a text which has literary merit in English. I mean, you know, and that's a struggle. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not a prize-winning translator. You know.
You're being very modest.
No, not at all.
Yeah. So do you look for music, rhythm?
Depend, all of those things.
Visual things, visualization?
All of those.
All of those?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So what about you, Katharine?
I think that very often when translators are asked about their work, they're asked to specify a particular kind of approach that they use. And I feel very resistant to that because essentially the premise of literary creativity is that you can do very different things with words. You know, we all have the same lexicon available to us, or all Arab writers have the same lexicon available to them, but they do extremely different things with them every time, which means no two texts are alike, and no two texts are necessarily using the ingredients they have and the tools they have in the same way. So for me, that means that every time I work with a new text, or perhaps every time I work with a new writer, because writers perhaps have a style that they stick with, I need to translate differently. So, I mean, that's not to say that there aren't certain technical issues which come up in Arabic, translation from Arabic specifically. There are. I think one of the ones that I always struggle with most is tense, because, you know, Arabic doesn't have tense in the same way English does. It has something called aspect, which kind of works a bit like tense, but sometimes really doesn't. So you have to be very careful when you're picking your tense in English. And, you know, there are technical issues like that which come up every time and you have to pay a lot of attention to. But I would say that every time I work on a new project, I have to think, okay, I'm starting afresh here. How am I going to do this?
Can Margaret put you on hold for a second because I don't follow up on that, right? So can you explain through working with Ahmed Nagy and Raja Alim, because they're two different writers, two different texts, two different ways of language, very distinct voices.
Yes. I won't use Raja Alim as a comparator because it was very long ago that I translated that now. But there's another writer whose work I've been working on recently. She's called Rawa Sonbul. She's Syrian and she writes short stories. And she's a wonderful writer. She takes very kind of unremarkable, usually, sort of everyday scenes. And I should say she's been living in Syria the whole time throughout the revolution and, you know, the war. And so she has to be careful not to get herself in trouble. But she, through these very kind of everyday scenes and details, she manages to look kind of very obliquely at the politics of what's happening. I just translated four short stories by her, actually, for the special issue on Syria, which I just mentioned, published by McSweeney's. And there were barely any full stops in there. It was almost, it was kind of sentence per paragraph because she has this wonderful, long, flowing, uninterrupted prose. And I really wanted to preserve that in English because it's such an essential part of how she writes. It's really consistent through all of her writing that she does that. Ahmed Nagy, very different. He's chatting to you. He's telling you about what it was like in prison. And as I said, it was a much more conversational style. So yeah, that's just one example of kind of two different approaches I'd use.
If there's an overriding thing, there are two overriding things across different works that I obsess about. One is the order of delivery of information. So that even if Arabic is verb, subject, object, the reader still gets the same surprises in the same places in the English as they would have gotten in the Arabic. And sometimes that means playing some games, and sometimes it means using a dreaded passive voice or something. But so that the impacts are in the same order. And if there's inversion, that it be purposeful. And the other thing is that Arabic literature, modern Arabic literature, is always already translated because nobody lives their daily life in Fusha. And so sometimes trying to undo that translatedness and trying to hear the rhythm of the language underneath or the situation that provoked the event that is then described in Fusha will produce a more readable English translation, whereas otherwise you might get something that in English reads as unduly stilted, where the Arabic reader might have instinctively just read through it or translated something like Ahmed Nagy, which is very conversational, but nonetheless perfectly fasih. In the Arabic, where you have to sort of re-vernacularize that, I think, to make it understandable to an English reader, because our literature is vernacular.
Guys ready? What? Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this very nice event. So I really enjoyed it very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for this event, and I thank Margaret very much for this very rich presentation. I really liked it. I have two questions to Margaret. First question is, how was the process of translating the title, Herz Mukamkam? I don't think that's easy. If you can just tell us about that. My second question is that I felt through the conversation that, I don't want to say confusion, but it's a fusion, more or less, with the author and the book. Is it a novel? Is it a diary? You knew and you know the author, so was that something that made it easier for you to translate, or was it maybe you started to know more than you should be knowing as a translator? So you're giving more information than only the rest with the translation itself as a professional. Thank you very much.
Thanks. That's a fun question. Yeah, the title. So the adjective in Arabic that we've translated as rotten, mekamkim, is when you leave a wet towel and then how it smells after that. So it's not really rotten. It's, I don't know, whatever that word is. And it was going to be hard to get that exactly. So in the end, we went for rotten, and that was in discussion with Ahmed himself, which brings me to your next question. I wouldn't say that there should be a rule about how much the translator should and shouldn't know. I think one has to remember that translation is always something that happens in the real world. There isn't a set of rules. There isn't somebody alone at their desk, contemplating, staring into space and finding the right translation for something. It's always a job that you do it with other people, you get paid a certain amount. As Ahmed talks about writing, it's the same with translation. Your back is aching because you've sat at the computer for too long that day. All of these things, they are the real world aspects of translation. And so if you have an author who is alive and who wants to have a conversation with you, then of course you're going to do that. And I mean, I think for me, it certainly enriched my experience of translating. I hope it's also enriched the end product.
Two of you, anything you'd like to add, Raphael or Margaret? Respond to Katharine?
And live and dead authors.
Live and dead authors?
It's a big difference.
Go for it, Raphael.
Well, I mean, I think it's good that Ahmed knows English well, because mostly when you deal with authors who want to look at their texts, is that they want to change something which they don't understand, and you know.
Margaret, more questions from the floor? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. Three fascinating presentations and conversation, and formally. I think I wanted to ask the question of voice, because that was a very important point. The question is this for me. Now, Ahmed Naji was receptive to the interventions of the editor from McSweeney, and also interventions from you. My experience, and I should just say that I'm involved with IPAF, my experience is that maybe for many Arab writers, this is the first time they get really edited. Whereas in Arabic, they tend to be extremely resistant to any editing interventions. And that's why we at the Prize ran the first literary editing workshop in Amman just this month. So my question is, why do you think that Arab writers are receptive to being edited in English, but they are not so receptive in Arabic? That's one. Secondly, I just want to say to Raphael, thank you very much indeed for translating some of the works, because I'm not going to reveal anything, because that would be unprofessional. Sometimes, as the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Prize, I feel that I have to read as much as I can of the long list and the short list, certainly the short list, and sometimes twice. And in some cases, I just put the book down and say, I'm going to wait for it to be translated, to read it, because I don't really understand it in Arabic. Not because it is so highly classical. I would want to say that I don't believe in Fusha, I believe in Fasiha. There's a difference between Fusha and Fasiha. Because there is so much Darija, Lahja, so much in it, that I say as a reader, I'm not going to do the work, because you have had an Egyptian readership in mind, you have had a Meccan or Rabati or a Palestinian, and therefore, sorry, I'm not going to do it. So I'll wait for it until it gets translated into English. So I'm very grateful for you, because you actually somehow make my life easier, because I read your translations in English and then I go back and read the Arabic. I call it a talhij under the idea of realism and all the rest of it. So these are my 2 points. Actually, the bits that, and I want to thank Samira, because you read it so well, Samira. Thank you very much indeed. I somehow, is that prison writing? Because it made it a place that I could consider going into, and I mean, he seems to have been fairly comfortable there, apart from...
It sounds like you haven't read the section about the toilet block. I'll maybe wait till you've got to that section and then ask the question again.
Well, you should go to Gaza camp, a refugee camp in Jordan, and you will see that, when the toilets are not blocked, then you have the problem, as it were, because the problem then goes out of your house into the street, as it were. So I just thought it was, I loved it. I love the bits that you've read. And I'm going just to say, because it actually highlighted to me the point that once you have unlearned something, it's so very difficult to learn it again. So he had unlearned to sit down and write, and now he's relearning it. He's turning into a child, going to school. So these are just a few comments. Thank you.
I think it's probably fair to say that the really bad parts of the experience aren't in the book. I think that there's an element, there must be an element of, he says he doesn't, and there's a section where he talks about he doesn't want to exploit or dramatize the people who are his fellow prisoners, and perhaps that even extends to some of the prison officers. And so I would be very wary about thinking of this as an invitation to prison. I really don't think so. I think he's kept, the horror at bay in a certain way.
I'd just like to say it's
So interesting to hear what you've said about judging the iPath, because being involved with, yeah, quite right. It just goes to show that every book has a range of readers. There is the reader who knows it very well, who comes from the same place, the same background, and there is the reader who doesn't, who comes from the other end of the Arab world and has absolutely no idea what's going on with all these dialect terms or with all these descriptions of a place they don't know. And I mean, that's one of the really fun parts of a translator's job, is getting into those details and making sure you understand them really well. And I think you also have to think about whether or not you as a translator are qualified to do a certain job, because I don't really want to translate a book about a place I know nothing about. I wouldn't feel qualified to do that. But you know, there will be somebody else out there, hopefully who is. And we also have to think about when we're translating for, you know, supposedly an English reader, which reader experience are we trying to capture? Are we capturing the experience of that familiar reader who knows the subject matter, knows the place really well? Or are we capturing the experience of somebody slightly more distant for whom that's exciting and strange? And that was quite an interesting thing about this book, because for Ahmed himself, prison is a somewhat ethnographic experience. He is an outsider and he's learning about prison as he goes along. So that was quite a gift to me as a translator, a bit like Margaret was saying about the Russian book, where, you know, Khalil al-Riz is also talking about, no, sorry, this was ICE. Sonal Ibrahim is also introducing these Russian ideas to Egyptian readers who don't necessarily know anything about it. It's quite a gift to be given that, because you're allowed to, you know, you're able then to explain a bit more for the reader without overly intruding on the text, which, yeah, is always a risk in translation, I think.
Yeah, no, it's perfectly true what you said about different ranges of readers. I'm thinking if I read something that is set in South London or something like this, you know, I mean, there, even in English, although we don't think of it as so regionalized, it really is.
You should read Who We Was by Gabriel Krause. It's all in multi-ethnic London English, and you'd probably struggle a bit with it. It's great fun though.
I might struggle with it, yeah.
I was given the signal that I should stop. So if you don't have any questions, we can chat over a drink, I believe. So shall we sort of pause here so we can all enjoy our drinks and crisps, I believe.
We have to thank you.